The Federalist Society is here to broaden out our perspectives and bring open debate to campus. And our goal is to try and bring as many people as we can and as many viewpoints as possible throughout the semester. If you can take the time to come to some of our meetings and learn about the society and what we want to do and maybe suggest some speakers, get in touch with me after this and I'll get your email information. And with that, Professor Camilo.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this discussion on gun rights and red flag laws, universal background checks. It is a pleasure of mine to be the faculty advisor for the Federalist Society. I was saying just before this started that I have been a member of the Federalist Society since 1998 when I was a first-year law student. And I'm privileged now to continue with a role in the society, including by being a mentor to some of you and a faculty advisor. It is a particular delight to be able to welcome John Lott to Widener and to Widener's chapter of the Federalist Society to have him here. He is the president and the founder of the Crime Prevention Research Center. He's a world-recognized expert on guns and crime. You probably have seen him on television or otherwise around the world talking about guns and their connection to crime, or the relationship between the number of guns available and crime. He's testified all over the world, including very recently at before the Pennsylvania legislature. He has held research or teaching positions at various academic institutions, including the University of Chicago, Yale, the Wharton School of Business at Penn, Stanford, and Rice University. He was the chief economist at the United States Sentencing Commission during 1988 to 1989. He's currently a contributor to the Hill newspaper and a columnist for Fox News and townhall.com. He has a PhD in economics from UCLA. He's a prolific author for both academic and popular publications. He's published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed academic journals and has written 9 books, including More Guns, Less Crime, The Bias Against Guns, and Freedomnomics. His most recent books are Dumbing Down the Courts, How Politics Keeps the Smartest Judges Off the Bench, and The War on Guns. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Lott here today. Please join me in
Well, I appreciate you guys having me here. It's too bad we don't have a debate, but I guess these things happen. You want to say, I was just telling your professor earlier, you're pretty lucky to have a conservative person who does constitutional law. At least you get kind of a different perspectives maybe with your teachers, because there's only a couple people like that I know in the profession. So at least you get a little bit different view than people might otherwise get. Anyway, so we were asked to kind of talk about red flag laws and universal background checks. And since I have to fill in the time, maybe I'll go on to other topics too. But with the, just use this. Okay. There we go. So I'll start off by talking about red flag laws. There's 17 states that have these red flag laws now. It's really amazing how quickly the map has changed, though. You go back just to March last year, there was only 4 states that had. So 13 of the 17 states have adopted it in about the last year and a half. And there's some differences across these state laws, but there's a lot of uniformity. But before I get into kind of the background for red flag laws, I want to kind of go through and say that there are already mechanisms there to go and deal with a lot of the concerns that people have with regard to red flag laws. or that they are supposed to solve. The big thing that you have is what's called civil commitment. And Pennsylvania has this. All the states have this. Even federal law has something called 302s. They go by different names in different states. Some places they're called Baker Acts. In California, it's 5150s. In Pennsylvania, I'm trying to remember, it's like the Pennsylvania Mental Health Care Act, I believe it's called. And what it allows you to do is, if you believe somebody's a danger to themselves or others, you can go and call the police or talk to a mental health care expert or others. And really, you just have to have kind of what's a reasonableness test that has to be met, which I'm sure you guys, if you don't know it already, will know soon. It's not much more than a hunch that the person is a danger to themselves or others. And then there'll be a hearing, and there'll be mental health care experts that will examine the person. And then those experts will come before the court, and they'll tell the judge what they think in terms of their diagnosis. And at that point, the judge will make a decision. There's really a range of different things that the judge can do. Obviously, the most extreme is involuntary commitment. But judges have a fair amount of discretion. So they could go and say, look, I don't think you're right at that stage where we have to involuntarily commit you, but I will encourage you strongly to go and seek treatment on your own. And maybe 2 weeks later or a month later, the judge could have another hearing to go and see how things are going. But there's a whole range of other things that judges can do. In theory, they could take away a person's weapons in exchange for not involuntarily committing them. Now, there's some safeguards built into this. So, for example, if you can't afford legal counsel is provided for you. But this focuses on what I think is kind of the main concern that's driving the red flag laws, and that's mental illness. The red flag laws, also known as extreme risk protection orders, while you hear them talked about in terms of mental illness, if you actually read the 17 state laws, only one of those states, even one time, mentions the term mental illness. The other thing that's pretty striking is that while these red flag laws, they're basically used for two things. Either one, you think somebody's a suicide risk, or two, you think they may go and commit a crime with a gun. But it's most of the time that they're used is with regard to suicide. And the other surprising thing that when you go and you read these laws, not one single one of these red flag laws actually require any involvement by mental health care experts. You think we're concerned about somebody committing suicide. I mean, you listen to President Trump talk about red flag laws or others, and it focuses a lot on mental illness, and yet it's surprising that they don't actually require mental health care experts to be involved in the process at all. Also, there's no legal counsel that's automatically provided. I mean, I've talked to lawyers who've been involved in these cases. They tell me hearings can run about $10,000 or so. That's a lot of money. The only outcome that you have from red flag law is whether or not the person should be able to go and own a gun. That's quite different than the range of different types of actions that you have with the civil commitments that we're talking about before. And you can imagine you're an individual, you may want to own a gun. But is it really worth $10,000 just to be able to go and own a gun? And it looks like nobody's collected precise data on this, but it looks like the vast majority, overwhelming majority of people who go through this process don't bother going and hiring a lawyer simply because the cost benefits are such that, the only thing they're going to lose is the ability to go and own a gun, and it's not worth $10,000, or at least it's not worth $10,000 to very many people to be able to go and keep their gun. The other thing also is the length of time involved before you have a hearing. So if you have civil commitment, you can have a hearing before the person's civilly committed. Then they have the mental health care experts evaluate the individual, and then you'll have a hearing afterwards when the mental health care professionals go and kind of advise the judge on what they've discovered. All that can take place literally within a few days. Most states have a 72-hour, up to 72-hour hold. Pennsylvania is a little bit longer. It's a little bit up to over 100 hours. That's the longest that I know of any of the states. But at that point, you're going to have a hearing and determine whether or not the psychiatric experts believe that the person is mentally ill and a danger to themselves or others. As I mentioned, these red flag or extreme risk protection orders do more than just concern about somebody committing suicide. They're also concerned about whether or not somebody may go and use a gun in a crime. And I was on the State Uniform Law Commission that was set up for a little while to go and evaluate putting together a model red flag law. They ended up not doing this. The gun control people on the panel, I think, were a little worried about the direction that the panel was going. But it was interesting because we had people from Indiana and Connecticut, the two states that have had those laws in effect the longest, come and speak to the panel. And I was asking him, I said, well, so what do you look for in determining whether or not you think somebody is going to commit a crime with a gun? And what they look for are basically three things, I would say. One is the person's past criminal history. They also look at gender and age. And my question to them was, well, okay, don't we already have laws that deal with people's past criminal history? If you're a felon, even if you're a nonviolent felon, you lose your right to own a gun for the rest of your life. Misdemeanor domestic abuse, you lose your right to own a gun for the rest of your life under federal law. And then states have a patchwork of different laws. In California, basically any misdemeanor will cause you to lose your gun for at least 5 years. In other states, it can vary. It can be 10 years for some violent misdemeanors, depending upon the state. But the question is, well, why not go and change those laws? If you think other crimes should be included that people are convicted of, then you could add those in. But what you quickly learn in the discussion is they don't want to have it so you have to be convicted. They'll bring up a case like the Nicholas Cruz case in Florida, in Parkland, where you had the police show up 45 times and they never even arrested the person. And so the argument is, if somebody has been arrested but not convicted, or somebody has had a complaint against them but never even arrested, that should be enough to be able to go and take away a person's gun. My response was, well, why don't you make that explicit in the law? I mean, I have to be honest, there was a reason why I was arguing that. And that is, it seems to me the courts are pretty clear on this. For something that's been deemed a fundamental right, you have to have some type of adjudication that occurs before the person's going to be able to lose that fundamental right. And my own guess is the reason why they wanted to leave it vague rather than put that explicitly in these different laws is they'd be worried that if they made it explicit, then it would invite courts to go more concretely and overturn the law. At least that's my guess. So what about these other things? What about gender and age? Well, they'll point out to you that males are more likely to go and commit crimes than females are, so they think it's only proper that that be taken into account. And they'll also argue that older people are more likely to go and use a gun to commit suicide than, let's say, middle-aged people are, or younger people are more likely to go and commit crimes than older people are. And, you think about this for a little while, and you can just imagine how something like this could be abused. So, for example, and again, this is just one worries that things can go in this direction. Let's say somebody goes and makes the claim, well, blacks are convicted of crimes at much higher rates than whites are. Should we take into account whether somebody's race or, Asians are very unlikely to be convicted of crime. So Asians, we shouldn't worry about at all. You would imagine that could be very troubling, just as with age or with gender being taken into consideration. Just because there's a fair number of young males who go and commit crimes doesn't mean that there aren't other young males who maybe are concerned about their safety and want to have a gun for protection. Likewise, my own research indicates that poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas are the ones who benefit by far the most from having guns. Simply, people who are most likely to be victims of violent crime are the ones who benefit the most from having the option to be able to go and protect themselves. Do we really want to have it so that the courts could go and say, well, you're a young black male, so you have 3 strikes against you, and we should be able to go and take your gun away from you because you're in a category that we think you're more likely to go and commit a crime. Let's hope we don't end up in that type of situation. But, it's kind of like the Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report, only here you're trying to do it without the aid of psychics. So, when I've talked to legislators in different states, when they've called me up to talk to me about these bills, one of the things I suggest is for them to offer an amendment that would say that these laws cannot systematically discriminate on the basis of race, age, or gender. And the interesting thing is to watch Democratic lawmakers argue against including that type of anti-discrimination provision in the laws. Probably the only law that they would do that for. All right, so the other thing about red flag laws is the only thing that they focus on are guns. And one thing I should have mentioned before, and that is it's interesting that these laws have really none of the protections that you see in terms of civil commitments. Paying for a lawyer, the speed with which a hearing occurs, because with red flag laws, it can be, depending upon the state, you can have your guns removed for 2 weeks or up to a month before a hearing takes place. And why is that? Why do they have a whole new law as opposed to, let's say, going and trying to tweak if they have some concerns about civil commitments? And I think there's a pretty simple reason for that, and that is it's a lot easier to go, when you have a new law, not to put in different types of protections for civil rights in there than it is to take an existing law and to pull out the different protections that are there, that are already in the law. But so red flag laws, the only thing that they deal with is guns. And take something like suicides, which is the main thing that red flag laws have been used for. The concern with regard to guns and suicides is that, if you remove guns from a home, you'll prevent a suicide from taking place. And the claim is that using a gun in suicide is much more, quote, successful, meaning the person's more likely to actually succeed in killing themselves than if they use another method. That's actually not true. And I just have some data here from Los Angeles County. You look at the different methods, shotgun to the head is about 99% successful. Cyanide is about 97% successful. Gunshot to the head is 97% successful. Shotgun to the head is extremely rare, just because most people don't have a long enough arm to go and do it. Explosives, over 96% successful. Hit by a train, or I could have put in hit by a truck, pretty similar, about 96% successful. Jumping from a height, almost 94% successful. Gunshot to the head, 89.5, and the same probability for hanging. I mean, I suppose one just has to go and ask Jeffrey Epstein whether there are other ways for people to go and commit suicide. And so if you really believe, if you're really concerned that somebody is a suicide risk, simply taking away their gun doesn't really seem to me to be a serious solution to that. You have to go and deal with something more. And the fact that you have no mental health care experts involved in the initial red flag decisions, that there's no mandate for counseling or anything else that's there, seems to me it's kind of strange that it focuses solely on taking away guns as the sole way of dealing with these problems. These laws have been used fairly extensively. Florida just passed this last year in March. In the first 9 months of the year after it passed, you had more than 1,000 confiscation orders. In Maryland, it went into effect October 1st last year, a little bit over a year ago. Just in the first quarter, they had over 300 people whose guns were taken away. Connecticut and Indiana, which have had these laws the longest, you seem to see the longer these laws are in effect, the more orders you have. And now in both of those states, you're seeing multiple thousands of cases each year where people's guns are taken away. I want to go and kind of talk a little bit about how these laws can backfire. Obviously, it's easy to think about, well, if somebody's at risk or a danger, if I merely take away the gun, hopefully that would reduce the risk of something bad happening. But you have unintended consequences with a lot of these laws. So let me give you an example. I have an extremely close friend of mine whose husband was murdered in front of her by a stalker. And this person had been stalking her for a while. It occurred in a place where they worked at night, in a karaoke place. It was a gun-free zone. She had a concealed carry permit, but she wasn't allowed to have it with her because of Tennessee laws at the time. Anyway, as anybody would, after her husband was murdered literally 10 feet in front of her, she was extremely depressed. And she was even concerned talking to psychiatrists and psychologists after the event because she was worried that she just had a stalker go and kill her husband. She was worried that they would say, well, you're very depressed, we should take away your gun, and she was concerned that she wouldn't have protection. Well, at least when you're talking to a psychiatrist and psychologist and they raise the point where you have this hearing before a judge, she would have the chance to go and explain her concerns about having her gun taken away from her. But when you're talking about red flag laws, what happens is that you may have a friend or a relative or a neighbor who may say, this woman's very depressed, I know she has guns, and simply out of legitimate concern on their part, go and inform the authorities, the police, that she's concerned about, the neighbor's concerned about her safety. And all the judge sees when they make their order is a piece of paper in front of them in these red flag laws saying what the concern is. And there's no hearing. He doesn't talk to the person whose gun is being taken away. Now, and then it could be 2 weeks or a month, depending upon the state, before there would be a hearing where she would have her guns taken away and she wouldn't be able to go and protect herself. What does that do to her willingness to go and talk to people? If if you're very depressed, being able to go and talk to relatives or friends or neighbors can be extremely helpful in there. Just sharing your feelings, just being able to go and make them out in the open. But now if you're worried that if you go and talk to somebody that they may, even with the best of intentions, inform and have your guns taken away, that may make you very reticent to go and share your feelings with those people. Now, what do you think that might do to depression? What do you think that might do to the risks of the person going and committing suicide? You have similar issues. Take police, for example. Police tend to be depressed at relatively high rates. Police tend to commit suicides at relatively high rates. But if a police officer has his gun taken away, that's essentially his job that's going to be ended at that point. What do you think that would do to police officers being willing to go and share their feelings of depression? I mean, they see bad things that happen all the time on their job. What do you think that might do to their willingness to go and talk through the problems and issues that they face with others? And is that going to be helpful that police are going to be afraid to go and share their feelings with people that they're close to. The thing is, liberals understand this when we talk about other issues. So when AIDS first became an issue, one of the things that people talked about doing is having a public list of people who have AIDS, because there was concerns about the transmission of the disease to other people. And the notion was there are people today who purposely try to go and infect other individuals. You know, they feel somehow, I don't know, get back at the world for making them have this disease. And the notion was if you had a public list, it would at least let people go and check. But the concern was raised, if you make such a list public, what's that going to do to people's willingness to go and get tested and to go and get treatment? And so the decision was made, we weren't going to have those types of public lists because we were afraid that that would make it so people wouldn't go to the doctors when they thought that they had those types of problems. The thing is, while they understand it in other areas, when it comes to something like guns, and also with guns, the types of civil protections they don't seem to think are necessary. Anyway, it's, again, to me, the big problem is why focus only on guns when there's so many other ways for people to commit suicide, and why focus on only the legal ownership of guns? I could go and ask you, how many of you, I'm not asking whether you use drugs, but how many of you, if I gave you a few days, how many of you think you could buy illegal drugs? Okay, half the students here. Okay, my guess is you guys are imaginative, probably more of you could figure out a way of doing it. What do you think the major... What do you think is the major source of illegal guns? It's drug dealers. Drug dealers have guns simply to protect their very valuable property that they have. It's not like a drug dealer can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? All right. They have to go and set up their own little kind of militaries to protect that extremely valuable property that they have. The notion that you're going to stop criminals or others from buying guns any more than you've been able to stop them from buying illegal drugs just isn't very serious of a solution. And so just because you say, I'm worried that you're going to use a gun to commit suicide, or I'm worried that you're going to go and use a gun to commit a crime. You look at something like mass public shooting, 6 months is a short amount of time for people to plan these attacks. Many of them planned a year, 2 years. The Sandy Hook attack was planned 2.5 years prior to the attack. The notion that somebody who's planning an attack that long in advance isn't going to be able to figure out some way to carry out the attack just doesn't seem to me to be very serious. Now, I just briefly talk about the empirical evidence. As I mentioned, most of these states, 13 of them have only had it for a year. There's really no data available for them to go and look at. There's only 4 states where there's really even a couple years or a year or so of data for us to be able to look at. 2 of them have had it much longer, Connecticut since 1999 and Indiana since 2005. There are a few studies out there that go and claim that immediately after Connecticut or Indiana's laws were passed, there was a drop in suicides. Here's the problem, though. There are very few academics who look at just one state or one place that changes its law and look at what happens before and after the law. And the reason is pretty simple, and that is if you only have one experiment, it's really hard to go and control for other things that might be happening, all right? So, one example that lawyers are familiar with, in fact, probably everybody's familiar with, is the Miranda decision. There are a number of academics who think that the Miranda decision in '63 was responsible for the increases in the 1960s. Is it possible? Sure, it's possible. The notion was it was much harder to go and make cases than it was before. The probability of conviction would fall, and therefore the risks of criminals committing crime would go down. Seems plausible. But the problem is we'll never know for sure. And the reason why we'll never know for sure is because we had a court decision that changed the law for all states at the same time. And there are lots of other things that were happening. There's a couple other major Supreme Court decisions dealing with crime type issues in the same term. How can you even disentangle those three things? All we know is crime went up afterwards, and there's so many other things that were changing during the 1960s. You have one experiment, one change. Now, maybe if some states already had a version of the Miranda ruling, and what you could do then, you could see what happened to their crime rates when they changed, or you could see what happened to the crime rates in the states where the 63 Miranda decision would have made a difference relative to the states that it didn't change. And you could see is there a relative change in crime rates in those two places. But looking at one place really doesn't tell you a whole lot. But even if you are going to look at one place, you're just not going to look at one place in isolation. What you're going to do is you're going to see how its crime rate changed relative to what it was in the past, but then you want to compare it to other states, either neighboring states or all other states that didn't change their law over that same period of time to see, was there a drop relative to the states that didn't change their law, or did it rise relative to them after you've tried to account for other factors? And none of that's really done in these couple studies. A friend of mine at William and Mary, Carl Moody, and I looked at the 4 states that we have at least multiple years of data for, and we looked at all the violent crime categories: murder, robbery, aggravated assault, rape, suicides, mass public shootings, and we really couldn't find any significant change in a beneficial direction as a result of these laws. Maybe part of it is, maybe these types of things do help, but maybe we already have civil commitments and that's picking it up. Or you could have both good and bad things that are happening. All right, so I want to talk about universal background checks a little bit here. You know, in some sense, this is similar to the issues with red flag laws. Everybody wants to stop a dangerous person from going and getting a hold of a gun. I don't think there's really any debate about that. What's not understood, I don't think, is how much of a mess the current background check system is. One thing that you frequently hear is that there are 3.5 million dangerous, prohibited people that have been stopped from buying guns because of background checks. That's simply false. What they should say is there have been 3.5 million initial denials, and that virtually all of those are false positives or mistakes. The last year that we have the full annual NICS report done was 2010. The Obama administration stopped putting this out. And in that year, there were 76,000 initial denials. There were 44 cases referred for prosecution. There were 28 prosecutions, and they had 13 convictions federally. You had a similar number of prosecutions and convictions by states across the country. So why is it so rare? First of all, just so you understand, these are really easy cases to prosecute. So you know, I don't know if any of you have ever bought a gun, but you fill out something called a 4473, and there's a lot of questions there saying, you know, have you been convicted of a felony, for example? And then you have to sign under, you know, penalty of perjury that all the statements that you've made are true. Let's say you're a felon and you sign the statement, but you put in there that you're not a felon. What's your argument going to be? That you forgot you were in jail for 5 years? You know, it's not really credible that you're going to forget those types of things. And, you know, it's pretty easy for the prosecutor to go and prove that you were in jail for 5 years. And so why do they have these mistakes? Well, it's one thing to go after a felon for trying to buy a gun. It's another thing to go after somebody simply because they have a name similar to a felon for buying a gun. So when you fill out the 4473, you put down your name, your social security number, your address, your birth date, your race, your eye color. You're giving them all this information. In fact, what they use most of the time is roughly phonetically similar names and similar birth dates. And the problem is that not only does that create a lot of false positives, but it's particularly for minorities that it creates the most problems. And there's a pretty simple explanation for that. Is that people tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. Hispanics have names similar to Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to blacks. 33% of black males in the United States are legally prohibited from owning a gun because of past felony records, just felony records alone. Whose names are their names most likely to be confused with? Other law-abiding good black males who want to go and buy a gun to protect their families and themselves. Private companies do criminal background checks on employees all the time. If private companies had an error rate that was 100, the error rate that the federal government has, they'd be sued out of existence. If you know an employer and you know somebody who does criminal background checks, go and ask them. Say, have you ever thought of using roughly phonetically similar names to go and do criminal background checks? They will look at you like you were from Mars, okay? And the reason is pretty simple. I mean, I've gone to people on the Hill in Washington and just said, maybe we should allow private employers to use roughly phonetically similar names in doing criminal background checks on employees. They will read you the Riot Act, as you would expect, because they'll tell you that would create a lot of discrimination that would occur. You'd have a lot of mistakes, and it would be certain groups that would be more likely to be hit by those mistakes than others. And then you say, well, that's a good point. That's a good point. Shouldn't that also apply to the federal government with doing its criminal background checks or other types of checks on people? And you'll get a deer in the headlights type looks, or at least that's what I've got. So here's the thing. It's easy to solve. All we have to do is have the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing criminal background checks or the background checks that the federal government mandates that private companies have to do. If it's good enough for private companies to have to meet those standards, why not require that the federal government has to do it? There's 5 stages of review for the next check system. The first stage review is done by the National Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosive Office. No lawyers involved, people just going through, just checking the paperwork. 94% of the cases are dropped at that stage. The second stage review, again, no discretion, really no lawyers involved. It's sent out to the ATF field offices, and the ATF field offices, again, just check the paperwork. Another 2 percentage points if the cases are dropped. So with no discretion at all, you have 96% of the cases that are dropped. There are other issues here too. These systems aren't costless. If you're in Washington, D.C., and you want to have, or in New York City, you want to have a background check on a private transfer gun where they have these types of universal background checks. Universal background checks are just background checks on the private transfers of guns. It's going to cost you at least $125 to privately transfer a gun. To give you some idea of how they've set these things up, let's say you and I were in D.C., and I'm going to gift you 4 guns, okay? You would think, I'm just giving it to you. Wouldn't there just be one background check, one person getting it? But no, they have a separate background check that would be required on each gun. So rather than having to pay $125, they're going to make you pay $500 for me to go and give you 5 guns. It's almost like they go out of their way to go and make it costly. Now, $125 may not stop you or I from being able to get a gun. But my concern is that the people who they're going to stop are going to be the people who need guns the most. Poor minorities. The people are most likely victims of violent crime in a place like D.C. or New York City. In California right now, they have background checks on buying ammunition. You're limited to 100 rounds purchased at a time. You can't buy more than 100 rounds in a week. And each time you go and buy ammunition, you have to have a background check. I don't know the exact precise average, but I'm understanding from a lot of people because they just started in July. But my understanding is we're usually talking about something like about $70 cost for doing a background check. So you can go and buy 100 rounds of .22 ammunition for $11 or $12, short round 22. But then you have to pay $70 on top of that just for the background check. So you're talking about like a 600% tax that they're effectively putting on the purchase of ammunition. Again, the question has to be who they're stopping. But here, think of it this way. What's the point of these background checks? If you believe these background checks reduce crime, and I don't, but if you believe that, don't you want to encourage people to go and do the background checks? They're doing something that you think helps reduce crime. Well, is the way I encourage them, making them have to pay these big fees to go and do the background check? Does that make sense? Why would I make them have to pay these fees? And in addition, if I do think that background checks reduce crime, doesn't it reduce crime for everybody, not just the guy who's going and buying the gun? And so why, in fact, if anything, here you have a very law-abiding person who's going out of their way to go and have the background check done. They're paying a fee to go and do this. Why make them have to bear the entire burden of the cost that's there if everybody's benefiting? As an economist, I would go and say if everybody benefits, the people who benefit should be the ones who pay, and so pay for it out of general revenue. You want it paid for out of general revenue for two reasons. One is you really want to encourage people to do it, but at the very least, you don't want to tax them for doing what you want them to do. And if everybody benefits, make everybody pay. But I guarantee you, if you bring that up to gun control advocates to pay for these background checks out of general revenue, they will fight against it. I give you 20 of these stories. I'll just give you one example. A few years ago, when Colorado was passing its universal background check, I got a call from a few state legislators there asking me what amendment I would suggest, or what amendments. And one of the amendments I suggested was to put up an amendment that would exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax that they were establishing there on the transfer of guns. It's like $25 each. Now they've just tripled it. The new governor has increased it to $75 tax on each gun that you transfer. With the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats in the state house, every other Democrat in the state house there voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax. How many state taxes can you think of that Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay? I can't think of too many. And, again, it gets to the question, who are they trying to stop from being able to go and buy a gun as a result of those types of taxes and costs? Again, there's a simple thing. Just like there's a simple fix to the false positives, there's a simple fix for the costs, and that is pay for it out of general revenue. If you really think it's producing this benefit for everybody, have everybody pay. There's a third issue that comes up with these universal background checks, and that is that they can be used to create a national registry. So what happens is you have somebody goes and buys a gun. They go through an FFL. You fill out the 4473. The licensed dealer, the FFL, keeps that information, okay? And the federal government, when it does the background check under law, it's required to get rid of that after 24 hours because they were worried that the federal government would create a national registry. Well, the thing is, now under universal background checks, the dealers have not only these 4473s on all new sales, but they're going to have it on all transfers, all people who legally obtained a gun over a period of time. So let's say 5 years from now, I have a new president and a new Congress, and they say, all that information you've been collecting on everybody who's been legally acquiring the guns over this period of time, we want you to send that into the federal government. And you have kind of then an instant national registration list on everybody who legally obtained a gun over the previous 5 years, or whatever period of time it is. Trump was about ready. I was privy to some of the discussions that were going on at the White House recently. President Trump was about ready to endorse a universal background check system, but he had some pretty interesting ideas on how to solve some of these problems. What he was going to do, and he may still do this, was to be able to do the background checks with an app on your cell phone. In order to protect people's privacy, you'd have to have a notary public involved, or the seller could put in the information that would be there. And a notary would have to attest to the identity of the individual there, just like they attest to the identity of people when you have something notarized. And then they'd have a code that they put into it. And it would solve a couple of the problems that we have here. One is the cost. They were going to write this law so that this could be used for even the states that already require these universal background checks. But rather than having to pay, high fees in some of these states, there are some states like Oregon where it's like only $55, but that's still a real cost to some people. Now you still have to pay a notary, but notaries you can get them for $10, $15, or whatever, it'd be a lot less. Plus, when you're talking about some rural parts of the country, you may not have a licensed dealer that's next door. You may have to drive, have two people drive an hour or something like that to go and do it. So it would solve that problem. The third problem it would solve would be the registration, national registry. And the reason why it would solve that is that you don't have a licensed dealer involved in the process. You would just have someone who is the government doing it through the app on the phone. And under current federal law, the federal government has to destroy that information 24 hours after the background check is completed. So there'd be no chance to go and create a national registry. And the other thing that he was going to solve, though my understanding, he was getting a lot of pushback from the Democrats that he was talking to, particularly Joe Manchin, was to eliminate the false positives that were there. So, which would be easy. Again, all they had to do is require that the federal government has to do background checks in the same way that private companies do. So all these things are easily fixable. So I have no problem with background checks per se. The question is, how do they work? And I'll just leave you with this one point to think about here, and that is, we hear all these polls, 95, 97% of people support these universal background checks. I don't know if you read these survey questions, but they're like one sentence long, and they're essentially just asking, do you think we ought to do more to stop criminals from getting guns? So it's like, of course, I think so too. The interesting thing is when these initiatives have been put on the ballot, the last time they were put on the ballot by Michael Bloomberg and his group was 2016. They were put on the ballot in Maine and Nevada. He outspent his opponents in Maine by over 6-1. In Nevada, he outspent his opponents by over 3.5-1. And yet, both of those initiatives were defeated. And in Maine, they lost by 4.5 percentage points. So if you really had 95 or 97% or even 80 or even 70% of people who really like these laws, you wouldn't have to massively outspend the other side and still lose, all right? But what happens is when you start reading these laws, you realize that they're a lot more complicated than that one sentence description that you see in the survey. So for example, I'll give you one example. You guys are in law school, you must know what the term imminent danger means, all right? It means that the person is right there threatening you right at that moment in time. So let's say a woman is being stalked or threatened by an ex. She calls you up late in the evening and she asks you if she can borrow your gun for a couple of days until she can go and buy one. You know she has no criminal record. You think she's well trained and able to go and use the gun. Unless the stalker is right there in front of her when you loan her the gun, you'd be committing a felony under these laws. Even if she says, the guy was just here, he's saying he's going to come back in 3 hours, and I go and get your gun right now, you would be committing a felony because even though you believe the guy's going to be coming back in 3 hours, it's not an imminent danger in terms of the person being there right there. There's a chance he may not even come. And so, people start hearing those types of things in the laws, where you have somebody who wanted to help out somebody else to unintentionally become a felon. Those types of things make it hard to pass these laws once, people kind of realize that there's a lot of fine print to the law set. Well, I could go on and talk about other things, but I know you guys probably have some questions. Let me just summarize things this way. If I were to go and talk about my research generally, I'd say the main thing that I've learned is that it's the most vulnerable people in our society who benefit the most from owning guns. There are basically two groups of people who benefit the most. People who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. What you find is that you're almost always talking about male criminals doing the attacking. And when a male is attacking another male, there's a smaller strength differential that exists there than when a man's attacking a woman. And you usually have young male criminals. So if a younger man is attacking an older person, there's going to be a larger strength differential than if he's attacking somebody closer to his own age. And so the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change in their ability to go and resist an attack than it does for your typical man. The other group of people who benefit the most are the ones, as I mentioned before, most likely to be victims of violent crime. Poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. It'd be great if the police were there all the time to protect people, but they're not. Police almost always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occur, something the police themselves recognize. And then the question is, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And I would argue that having a gun turns out to be by far the safest course of action for people to take. But we can go into that more if you're interested in asking questions. But anyway, I'm happy to go and answer questions.
So you said that the 4470 is